Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, I am joined by Professor and author Stan Goldberg. And today, we're going to be talking about a number of things, but we're going to be talking about senior moments. You know, sometimes we all make jokes about, oh, I had a senior moment. I forgot this, I forgot that, but senior moments are real for a lot of people. So we're going to be talking to Stan about those and about his book and everything that he's up to. So, Professor Stan Goldberg, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm delighted that you asked me to be on your show.
Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'll give you the short version of my history. I went to school at the University of Pittsburgh. And one of the problems I had then was explaining to my mother all of the different changes in what I was majoring in. So she was a first-generation American from Poland and a wonderful but a very simple woman. And oftentimes she had difficulty understanding what I was trying to tell her. So I occasionally would listen to her conversations with friends and trying to explain to them what I was currently doing that week. So it was philosophy one week, political theory the next, logic the third. And she eventually got through all of those. But what stymied her was speech language pathology, which I had a great deal of difficulty explaining to her. The final explanation I heard when she was talking to a friend was, he does something with children's tongues. And I thought, okay, that's good enough. I went on to be involved in a lot of the things at the university. And one of the things, this was now in 1965, and I was involved in the civil rights movement and was one of those horrible people who the South labeled as northern agitators. So I spent time down in Alabama. And the hardest thing then was explaining to my mother while I was calling her from a Montgomery jail. Following the University of Pittsburgh, I went on to teach at a place called Governor State University, which is south of Chicago. And there I developed a love of blues because we were only 30 miles north of Chicago and spent a lot of time there at a lot of the live blues clubs. From there, I came to San Francisco. And when I got out here and I thought I was filthy rich based on what I got from my house in Chicago. And I told the realtor what I could pay. And I said, what could I get? Thinking I could get a mansion out here. She said, well, you can get a garage. And I realized that as wonderful as it was being in San Francisco, that wasn't going to be sufficient to pay the bills. So I started looking for something else I could do while I was still at the university. And that, somehow I drove past a self-service laundromat. I thought, okay, there it is. I bought one and did well with that and decided that I wanted to upscale a little bit. And I thought, well, what can I do with the laundromat? And I thought, well, when you're at a laundromat, it's boring, nothing to do. So what do you end up doing? I thought, why don't we have a bar in the laundromat? So that's what I started looking for. And I bought a bar, and I thought, well, I'll just put in the laundromat. And I said, no, it's much better that this is a unique place where I could have live music. So we started having live music, and I was doing all of this while I was still at the university. I developed what's called a REM sleep disorder, a definite curveball. And this occurs where you not only have difficulty sleeping, but you thrash a lot at night. And it became so bad that I was having difficulty teaching. Decided that it was time to retire because I couldn't really teach anymore, and that was at 57. And the following year, thinking I now can really float through life, I developed prostate cancer. So there we had another curveball. When I realized, I wasn't going to die immediately, but there was a chance that I might in the future, I looked for ways of accepting the possibility that I might be dying within 3 or 4 years. And through a set of really bizarre circumstances, I found out about hospice. And I became a hospice volunteer and did that for 8 years. And while I was doing that, I realized that there were incredible stories that were being told to me by my patients. And at first, I just started writing them down, thinking, I'll just use these for my own benefit. And I realized after doing that for about 4 years that I had a book. And that became the next book I wrote, and that it was called Lessons for the Living. So I remained a volunteer up to the point where I really wasn't able to focus as much as I needed to on my patients, because they're going through. It's very difficult to describe what a dying person thinks about, but they're essentially trying to go through what they need to do to have a peaceful death, and that really requires total concentration. And so I regretted not being able to continue doing hospice work, but I knew I couldn't do that. But I knew I could still write. And so I started writing about various issues that people I knew were struggling with. Things such as not only end of life areas, but also chronic illness, cancer, dealing with children who have disabilities. And I started writing that, and I realized that if I was writing for the professional audience, I might have, 200 or 300 people reading that article in a professional journal. But if I focused on providing information based on research to average people, I could get 10, 20, 30,000 reading the same article. And so that's what I've been doing. The last switch, and it's not really a switch, but it's the addition, is I realize that many people still find these topics very difficult to deal with, but everybody loves a good story. So I started working on 2 novels, and the one that I'm now looking to find a literary agent for deals with what happens when you do something at an early age that you believe is so horrendous that you don't think you could find forgiveness even from God. So I'm doing that, and I thought, fine, I've now gotten rid of all my curveballs. I've now honed in on how to approach these things. When a year ago I was diagnosed with an early form of Parkinson's. So my life, I think, has been defined by curveballs, and it actually has been elevated. Now, I would have preferred not to have any of these, but that's the way life goes. So that's where I am at this point now, really looking at how aging changes what we do, and if there's anything that occurs in how we approach aging that could be beneficial to people with different problems, different curveballs in their life. So that's where I am. That's the short rendition of my life.
Well, it sounds like with these curveballs, you hit a home run. And before we get into the aging aspect, you said you heard one of my interviews and you heard about my son being autistic and stuff. And you were kind of talking to me about some stuff in the green room. And so I wanted you to talk about that and expand on that in case we have parents out there with kids with learning disabilities and different special needs issues. So why don't you go ahead and kind of talk to the listeners about what you were talking to me about in the green room and expand on it.
Sure. Excuse me. One of the things, I mean, I taught at San Francisco State for 25 years. And one of the things that I kept seeing is that quite often when we professionals try to tackle a problem that parents have, we make a couple mistakes. The first one is we don't start with what the parents say they need. I changed that when I was doing both private practice and demonstration therapy in the clinic, where when a parent came in, instead of having a program that I thought was terrific and that I developed, I started with asking them with the following question. What would you like to work on this week? Very simple. And what would happen is they would talk about something that was incredibly significant, not only to them, but to their child and to their family. And that's where we would start. So that's the first problem that I saw occurring. And I think I know it still happens, not only with kids, but anytime you're interacting with a professional, and I include myself, what they would like to do, what they would love to do is tell you what you should be doing, rather than asking you, what would you like to help them doing? So that's the first one. The second is when people have problems or their children have problems, what we tend to do is focus on the surface. So I'll give you a very good example. I know a lot of parents struggle with trying to get their kids do self-help behaviors, brushing their teeth, going to the bathroom, dressing, a whole variety of things. And professionals will come up usually with a program, very good program sometimes, that involves reinforcing a behavior, structuring some things, and that's fine. And eventually that works. But what they may not realize is that if we have an understanding about how memory works and how practice can facilitate memory, there may be more efficient ways of learning new behaviors. Great example. Look at Steph Curry. Steph Curry can make shots, at mid-court, and it appears he's not even thinking about it. Well, he probably isn't. But how did he do that? I marveled at it for a long time until I started looking at the research that's been done in memory. And it talks about making memories stronger, reinforcing them. And there's this whole process of layering memories. So if you do something once, so for another example, someone gives you a phone number. And you can't write it down. You don't have your iPhone, and you try to remember it. So you say it to yourself once, and you walk away, and you go get a cup of coffee, and you go to make the phone call. And what happens? You have no idea what that number was. Well, you could have done something different. One of the things you could have done is repeated the number 10, 12 times in a row. That adds new layers to memory. You could have done other things, but we can go into that later. Or I have a book called Ready to Learn. A lot of those things are in there. So Steph Curry's trainer talked about him practicing a minimum of 500 shots every day. So that all of those behaviors are layered so much into his memory that he doesn't have to think about what he's doing when he gets up in mid-court. It's just automatic. And if you watch him, especially in practice, you see that occurring. It's like instantaneously. So there's that skill, or that strategy of practice can be applied to kids who you would like to learn how to potty train. Someone playing tennis and they're trying to master a backhand, or a senior who is trying to learn a way of acting that is diametrically opposed to having a senior moment. It's all the same. It's been a while, but I've found that there's a universality in some of the things we do. If you think about it, um, you can have termites in California building their mound the same way that they do in Illinois and Chicago and in Florida. Now, how do they do that? There's a universality, something in an insect's physiology. It's the same thing on how we learn. There's a lot of things about learning that we really aren't familiar with or we don't think about, but they're present all the time. So what I try to emphasize in not only in my current book, Preventing Senior Moments, but in everything that I write is, yes, you can treat a problem by looking at its surface structure, or you can look beyond that. What is happening that creates this universality? It's almost like you're a physicist. Physicists think about things that exist everywhere. You don't have a separate notion of gravity that only applies in San Francisco or in Fort Lauderdale. It's everywhere. And the principle, applies no matter what planet you're on. So that's one of the basic carryovers I find that are important, regardless of what kind of problem you're trying to solve. So currently, what I'm trying to solve is, how do we look at senior moments and how do we prevent them?
Speaking of that, let's talk about the 6 myths of senior moments that, you're getting older, that this is not preventable. It's just how it is. So talk about that and what your opinion is on that.
Yeah. Well, when I've got to back it up a little bit and tell you that the first time that I started getting concerned, my mother comes, my mother is no longer alive, but she would come to visit me in San Francisco, usually once or twice a year. And the last time she came out to visit, I came home and my expectation was that she would be doing what she always does, which was she would be cooking, she would be cleaning, and I expected some noise from the kitchen. I expected some smells coming up, and there was nothing, and she wasn't there. Now, there was no reason she would go out for a walk because she didn't do that, and no one came to pick her up, and I started getting concerned. So my house is on the ledge of a slope. And when you go out out of the back of the house, you're on a deck, and it's a steep incline into the forest area. So when I couldn't find her anywhere in the house, I became really concerned. So I ran out to the deck, and the gate was open, and I really became concerned. And I reached for my phone. I was ready to call 911, and I saw her emerging from the forest. And she had a bunch of sticks and leaves in her hand. And I said, "Mom, what are you doing?" And her response was, "I'm straightening up the forest." I said, "But Mom, it's a forest. It's supposed to look that way." Well, I thought I had just another senior moment to add to a long collection of them. And about 6 months went by, and unfortunately, she died. And when I went down, because she had lived in Florida, and I went down and I met some of the people who she spent her time with. And at that time, what they said to me was they had been concerned about my mother for a couple of years because she wouldn't go out at night. When someone came to help clean her house, she insisted that the furniture be placed back exactly where she put it. And there were other strange behaviors. And I realized that what I had interpreted as a senior moment really was the beginning of Alzheimer's. So what tends to happen is when you look at senior moments as something that's humorous, you can forget important information about what is occurring. So, that's one of the myths. Senior moments are not funny. The second one is that they're momentary brain glitches confined to seniors. Well, that's not true either. There's no starting age for senior moments, nor are they momentary. When someone has a senior moment, something has always preceded it. The woman who continually forgets her keys in the morning, well, she may not be sleeping well at night. She might have, the same kind of sleep disorder that I have. So you should always look for a preceding event. Another myth is that all senior moments can be lumped together. Well, I think that myth probably arises because we think of senior moments as something that is embarrassing, no matter what they are. But that's not true. There are actually 9 types of senior moments, each one of them resulting from a different type of a problem in processing information. Just a quick example. One of my worst senior moments involves sequencing. So here's an example. I'm down in my office, I'm writing, and I decide I need a cup of coffee. By the time I'm up to the kitchen, guess what? I have no idea why I'm there. It's something that happens quite often. Now, that's very different than what happens when I forget my keys when I go out to the car. So again, you can look at, there's 9 types and they're listed in the book, but each one tells you something about how you're processing information. And each one of those types of errors you can fix with certain strategies. There's another myth that senior moments are the result of memory problems. Well, some of them are, but not all. Some of them have nothing to do with memory. So, for example, the example I gave, the sequencing problem, there's other things that are involved, not necessarily memory. Another myth is that senior moments are an inevitable part of aging. Well, they're associated with aging, but they're not inevitable. I know a friend of mine who is in his 80s. And his mind is as sharp as it was, when he was 40. I, for example, who am now 78, my mind is probably as sharp as it was when I was 78. So it's not necessarily related, to aging. There's other people who talk about that senior moments are these isolated events that have nothing to do with you. Well, that's not true. If you think about identities, we are what we do, what we think, what we feel. Everything is part of that identity. And someone who's having senior moments may quite often have changes in their identity. So it's not something, senior moments are not different from who we are. It's a part of us. And unfortunately, sometimes it's a part that defines who we are in a way we really don't like. And the last myth is that you can eliminate senior moments just through motivation. No. There are very few things that I've found that rely just on motivation. I mean, even outside the area of senior moments. Motivation is important, but it is not by far the most important element in getting rid of them. So those are the 7 myths. And there are ways in which, I call them strategies, that can prevent most of them.
Well, let's talk about the origin of senior moments because, growing up, we all know old people and we know that they might have senior moments, but we might not really understand the origin. So just kind of explain the origin of senior moments for the listeners.
Now, let's first start with how we process information, because that's important not only for understanding senior moments, but understanding how we get through the day. The first thing that happens when you're processing information is attention. You have to attend to what is in front of you. Once you attend, then you have to understand what you just attended. And then you need to store it. Once you've stored information, hopefully you want to use that in the future. So you have to retrieve it. Once it's retrieved, then it has to be used. So attention, understanding, storage, retrieval, use. Those are the 5 stages of information processing. If you have a hiccup in any of those stages, you're going to have a problem in information processing. And as we get older, you may have more of these hiccups. What makes it, what confounds it even more has to do with the speed in which we process information. The best way of thinking about it for me is to think about a machine that has 2 gears in it. And in order for the machine to operate efficiently and effectively, the teeth of the gears have to mesh perfectly. Now, what happens as we age, there's a discrepancy between the speed in which we would like something to go and the speed the brain says, hey, this is what I can do. And often, even with everything else working perfectly, if you have this inappropriate crunching of gears, you can have a problem in what you're processing. And that misunderstanding can often lead to what we call a senior moment.
Okay, well, in your bio, you talk about strategies that you can use to prevent senior moments from occurring. So talk about those strategies.
Yeah, the first one, and I think to me, it's a universal strategy, whether we're talking about senior moments, about children who have learning differences, whether we're talking about learning a new behavior, is slowing down. What slowing down does is puts those gears back in sync. What we're doing is we're saying, look, we would like to be able to function as we did when we were 20. It's a hope, and except in maybe very rare behaviors, we can accomplish that. So what do? Well, we can complain about it. We can quit trying to do something because we're not successful. We can go through a whole variety of different behaviors. But the one that I found to be most effective, and this, in 25 years of doing speech pathology, I found to be effective in almost all forms of communication, is to slow down. You can slow down in listening, in reading, or in doing something. I remember working with a woman who wanted to learn how to use a new backhand in tennis. Now, I'm at best a mediocre tennis player. So my advice was based on learning theory, not professional experience. And what I know is when you want to learn a new behavior, if you can slow down its basic components, restrict them, you can learn that behavior. So we went through a series of different practice techniques where she tried, looked at each component of the swing. And like Steph Curry, she hit it. She hit hundreds of balls against a back wall, and she eventually learned that behavior. So slowing down, very simple. Another one is to use patterns. And, I talked about this a little earlier about kids who are trying to learn a new behavior. What I found, and actually what the research has shown, is that when the brain lays down a memory, it doesn't lay down individual points, but rather a pattern. So let's go back to the Steph Curry example. So when his brain is saying, oh, okay, Now I'm learning how to shoot from 65 feet rather than 50. Each one of his specific behaviors are not, learned individually, but it's learned as a sequence, a series. Now, we can use that information in two different ways. For example, if my senior moment involved leaving the house without either my keys or my wallet or my cell phone, something that I used to do a lot, I can say, okay, there's a pattern possibly that's going on here that leads into that. So I examine my behavior and think, okay, I'm getting up late. I'm not having my second cup of coffee, and I'm trying to get the kids ready at the same time. Well, here are three elements that the brain puts together and goes, okay, I'm going to forget his keys. So by understanding a pattern that leads up to a senior moment, what we can do is we can break that pattern. We can stop one of the things. So let's say in this case, it might be, if I had that third cup of coffee, maybe I will have enough attention to be able to remember these three objects. So that's one way of preventing the senior moment. What you can do is you interrupt the chain. The other way of using it is to reinforce a new behavior. So let's say the new behavior I'm going to use in order not to lose my keys or not to forget them before I leave the house is I'm going to have a picture of each object I need to remember. I'm going to paste that on the front door, and that's followed by a number 3 that I'm going to put on my car. And in the car, I'm going to have a happy face. Okay, silly things to do. But the brain now says, okay, this is the pattern to not forgetting. And after doing this a number of times, what'll happen is it'll trigger that new response. So those are two ways in which you can use patterns. Another way is what I call challenging your brain. And this is something that is generally ignored. For many years, there was a belief that once brain cells die, they never can be regenerated again. And so as a result, we looked at Alzheimer's and at dementia and just general aging as saying, okay, the brain is losing cells, and let's just, try to teach the person to live with consequences. But within the last 10 years, they found that the brain actually can generate new neurons and new synaptic connections, even in people with dementia and Alzheimer's. Now, let me one clarification. I use those terms interchangeably, but they're really not. Alzheimer's is actually a form of dementia, a lot of different forms of dementia. Alzheimer's is one that's, I think, 65, 70% of all dementia people have Alzheimer's. But anyway, so that was a big realization. So the takeaway for people like me who are directly involved in helping people change is, well, if that is going to create new neurons, it sounds like there's a possibility that if this aberrant behavior is caused by fewer neurons, then what'll happen if I can create more of them? So there was a wonderful article that was pretty much ignored in 2003. It was two researchers. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to help public school teachers in teaching creative skills to children. And what they did was they came up with 5 behaviors that they felt would help creativity or were necessary for creativity. And I read through those, and I thought, these sound pretty much like what folks involved in cognitive theory are talking about. 5 things that challenge the brain, or 6 things actually that challenge the brain. And, they involve things like being able to provide multiple answers based on available information, constantly analyzing what's being created, a willingness to redraft and start over, and on and on. Well, I looked at that and I said, I do these things. Yes, I agree they're part of creativity because I do wood and stone sculpting. And I said, I do every one of these things when I'm involved in sculpting. But when I'm writing an article or a book, I do the exact same things. So is there something about creativity and cognitive effort that is going to help those of us who are getting older to have fewer senior moments? And that's a strategy, a general strategy that I suggest to my clients, is that instead of sitting there and watching the 4th rerun of Law and Order, get up off the couch, go into the kitchen and invent a new recipe. See, creativity and cognitive effort doesn't require, it's not based on what you end up producing. End products are great. It'd be terrific to have a wonderful new Italian dish that I made. But I'm going to be helping my brain, even though, by going through different substitutions of ingredients, even though if what I'm producing is inevitable. Another strategy is to make it lasting. And this was alluded to in your interview, about your son, and the whole notion that there were strategies that you were using and the interviewer talked about for her child that were lasting. The use of pictures rather than just talking, but saying something. Like, to give you an example, right now, as I'm speaking, as important as I may think what I'm saying is, it vanishes the minute I stop saying that word. So there's no lasting significance. You may have remembered some of the things, but it's gone. But what happens if there is a picture of what I'm saying? Similar to what the interviewer suggested about self-help skills in the bathroom, about a picture of a toothbrush and some other things, and on and on. Good example of how well this worked. When I was still doing my hospice work, there was a woman who was living alone, and she was getting close to dying, but still was able to be self-supporting. But there were certain things that she was having grave difficulty with because she also was developing dementia. And I came in one time to spend time with her. She was living at home, and it was very cold. And the heat was turned off, and she had on 4 sweaters. And I asked her, why was she so cold? And she said she didn't know how to turn on the thermostat. So, I mean, it's simple. You go to, you think about it, you go, how difficult could that be? You go to a thermostat, you just press the button or you press the dial, and you have heat. Well, all of that at that point was verbal. I could instruct her for 2 days and it still wouldn't register. So what I came up was with a strategy that made it lasting. What I did was I constructed 4 different pictures and I placed them close to the thermostat. One was pictures signifying cold, indicating that if she was cold and there was an arrow pointing to the right, to turn the thermostat knob to the right. If she was hot, and there was another picture there of someone with heat who was sweating, with an arrow pointing to the left. So that just took 10 minutes to do, and she never had that problem again. I mean, it wasn't that there was anything that stupendous about what I suggested, but I really tapped into what I call, those universal patterns. It was something that was lasting. She could see, it was concrete, and it was much easier to understand. Another strategy is to remain focused. What happens quite often is we are so tied up in doing so many things, or multitasking, or trying to squeeze every bit of attention we have when it can't be done, that we have problems in attention. And if you remember, I said that first step in information processing was attention. If you screw up at that level, everything that happens afterwards is going to be subject to becoming a senior moment. So it's important to focus. The next strategy has to do with managing your environment. And this is one of the simplest things to do. A lot of times when we think about the occurrence of something, we view it in isolation. We think that that this is the only thing that happens. I'll give you a very poignant example right now, and probably one that's very controversial, but I'm not taking sides on this, is the Israeli-Palestine conflict. When someone looks at the horrendous things that the Hamas did, they think about just that event without thinking about what would cause a teenager to behead an infant. I mean, to me, that's mind-boggling. So as horrendous as that is, one needs to think about what occurred prior to that. The same thing has to do with the Israeli, not occupation, but the Israeli control of Gaza. Why would the Israelis feel it was so necessary to hoard off 2 million people from doing anything that would result in them coming into Israel? Okay. So without taking positions in either way, what I'm trying to point out is that even the most horrendous situations have pre-existing conditions that cause them. Doesn't mean they're justified, but they cause them. Same thing happens when we're looking at a child who acts out in school, a senior who gets lost somewhere, or a child who has difficulty learning. It's pre-existing conditions that are important to look at if we want to change a behavior. The last strategy, and the one that I think is also very critical, is practice. You mentioned in your interview that one of the problems that your son had was with structure. Now, structure is something, a lack of structure or problems with structure is something that we find in most kids that have language problems, some kids with behavioral problems. But structure is something that's hidden from us. It's there all the time. And it has to do with how the brain remembers things. Give you a very good example. When you meet somebody for the first time, what do? We usually smile, we extend our hand, we shake it, and we say, "Hi, my name is Stan." Well, how do we do that? I mean, I'm 78, and I've been doing that for hundreds of thousands of times. It's not that every time I say it, it's a new behavior, but rather stored in my brain is the structure for greeting somebody. If there are problems with that structure, or the structure is defective in any way, then I'm going to have difficulty with greeting. Now, sometimes that structure not only it can be distorted, but sometimes you can't access it. I had a friend of mine with Alzheimer's, lives in England, and he said for him, the most frightening event that ever happened to him was he was walking across the street, and when he got to the curb, he didn't remember how to step on it. Seems bizarre, but that's part of what happens. Our lives are governed by structure. The same thing is true with senior moments. If we want to develop a new behavior, a non-senior moment behavior, what we need to do is practice that structure. Back to Steph Curry. The structure for hitting a basket without hitting net is very precise for him. Every time he gets that ball, he's going to use the exact same structure, whether he's at 50, 40, 30, 20 feet. Some modifications, but there's a basic structure there. We can use that understanding of structure in preventing senior moments.
Well, tell us about any current or upcoming projects that you're up to that people need to know about.
Well, what I've always done is I've always been reluctant to write about something I've never experienced. I'm one of those people that in the past, when I'm at a party and someone starts talking about a problem, I'm always able to say, yeah, I know. And I've always loved to be able to say, I don't know anything about that. But unfortunately, as I said, that's not the case. So with my earliest form of Parkinson's, I'm at a point now, there's no tremor or most of the things people associate with Parkinson's, but I'm learning things that nobody is writing about. And a lot of that has to do with some of the things that I discovered when writing the book Preventing Senior Moments. So I'm at the point now of looking at whether that's going to be a feasible project. The other thing I mentioned earlier is I spent about 10 years now on a novel, and without going into too much detail, it explores something that I know a lot of people wrestle with: is how do you get over the guilt you feel for something that you did that you do not believe is forgivable. So that's what this book is about. And for me, the interesting thing about it was, although I spent 10 years on it, if it never gets published, that's okay. Because what I did is during that 10 years of working on it, I was able to continually challenge my brain to do things that I know, it was almost like taking my brain to the gym, where I'm constantly honing it up. So I'm sort of, if someone out there is a literary agent, they would like to represent it, that's terrific. The other thing, I've just been recently asked to be a regular contributor to Psychology Today. And so I've had 2 articles that are there now, and I'm writing the next one right now, and it has to do with looking at the equivalency of loss. And my position is, it doesn't make a difference if you're feeling grief from the loss of a lifelong spouse, your pet, or a vase that you cherished for 20 years. Loss is loss and grief is grief. And that there are ways, backed again to the universal ways of getting over grief and loss. So those are the things, plus spending more time with my granddaughters and more time doing sculpting, that I plan to work on now.
Okay, we'll throw out your website so people can keep up with everything that you're up to and read your work when it comes out.
Yeah, I have a website, and the website is Stan Goldberg Writer, WRITER.com. And on that website, I've got more than 200 articles that deal with a lot of the issues we're talking about today and others. And also they can find my work on Psychology Today by just typing in psychologytoday.com. And they'll be taken to the website and just type in my name, Stan Goldberg, and they'll come to all of the articles I've written for them. My other books, one's on caregiving and end of life issues, and appear on Amazon, along with in a book I wrote many years ago called Ready to Learn, which looks at strategies for parents of kids who learn differently.
Close us out with some final thoughts. Maybe if there was something I forgot to touch on that you would like to talk about, or just any final thoughts you have for the listeners.
Yeah, I think you were terrific. You hit everything. But if there was a one thought that I have, and it was about preventing senior moments, is that what we do as seniors is rarely laughable. What we're doing is we're trying to get by as best we can. And there are many ways of doing that. One way is to look at what we don't like, what we're doing, to determine what we can do differently. And there are many strategies we can use. We can accommodate our aging, or we can grumble about it all the way until we die. I prefer to accommodation.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, StanGoldbergWriter.com. Please be sure to follow, rate, review, check out his episode if you know of anybody struggling with senior moments and wanting some answers and readings on it. Refer them to Stan Goldberg. If you have any guests or suggestion topics, cjackson102 at cox.net is the place to send them. As always, thank you for listening. And Professor Stan, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise.
It was my pleasure. It's an honor being on your show.
For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.